We've all been there. The washing machine is beyond repair. And all you want to know is which new model you should buy. Well, that's where the Which Just Buy This recommendations come in. Hand-picked recommendations that our product testing experts think you should buy. We've got over 50 products with a Just Buy This recommendation, from dishwashers to TVs, cordless vacuums to fitness trackers. And yes, it can be useful to spend time reading our in-depth reviews, but when you need a quick fix, a Just Buy This recommendation can save the day. To find out which products have our new seal of approval, just head to which.co.uk/justbuythis. That's which.co.uk/justbuythis. And get it right with Which.
In 2024, the world's banks increased their fossil fuel financing, channeling $869 billion into the hands of big polluters. So is your money fueling the climate crisis? Welcome to Which Money. Hello, I'm your host, Lucia Ariano, and today I have with me Which's banking investigator, Chiara Cavaglieri. Hello.
Hello.
And also Louise Wagner, Bank's campaigner at Reclaim Finance. Hello, Louise.
Hello, everyone.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. Shall we start from the top then? Chiara, you've recently done an article looking into this. What made you look into this area to start with?
It's just an area that we know people find really complex and confusing, myself included, I will add. It's an area that people care about but understand very little. There's a few reasons for that, I'm sure, but broadly, anyone who wants to know more about how their bank might be financing fossil fuel companies can only do so much. I think anyone who's dared to have a look at their bank's ESG reports will say that they're really confusing, really complex, and I think most people just give up, to be honest.
And you say that banks have backpedaled on climate commitments. How so?
Well, there's a few different examples. Maybe the most stark is just that financing has gone up by so much. The first time since 2021, I think. Some of those banks have increased their financing by more than 10 billion year on year. We've also seen some of the UK banks hit the headlines. Barclays and HSBC left the Net Zero Banking Alliance. They followed in the footsteps of some of the big American banks, including Chase, which operates in the UK. I think there's just a general sense that things have gone backwards.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that we are all observing at the moment, that in general, climate and ESG topics are just on the track of backtracking and disappearing from public discourse on the one hand. And as Chiara was saying, also from the screen of large financial institutions, including banks. And I think there is not one single easy way to explain it. And I think it's a bit of like the situation that we're in today is a multi-crisis society where we see one crisis after the other unfolding, and including the climate crisis becoming worse and worse. And one trend that we're seeing as well developing in this scenario is a trend of greenwashing, which is a bit the opposite of greenwashing, like where you take steps that you claim to be sustainable, you finance projects that you claim to be green or sustainable, which can be contested a lot, and you brag about it. But then greenwashing is that supposedly financial actors are still doing green or sustainability or taking sustainability activities, but they're not talking about it because they are afraid of this retaliation climate in this climate hostile environment.
That is quite some change, isn't it? I know was it 2023 when we looked into greenwashing?
Oh, it was the first time that I had looked into current account providers. I think we had done some work on greenwashing in investment products. But 23 was the first time that I had looked at current account providers, the ones that are financing fossil fuel deals and fossil fuel companies. And yeah, two years later, it's not better, it's worse. I think is the general sense. Every campaigner I spoke to, and I spoke to half a dozen, sounded quite blue, to be honest. I think there was much more hope, I think, a few years ago when I spoke to campaigners than there is now. I think I definitely got the sense that people were a bit less hopeful and more worried about the way things are moving and the direction things are going in.
I mean, what's just coming across already is just what an incredibly hostile landscape this is all painted upon, and complex. There's so much to consider. I mean, coming back to then analysing banks, I mean, Reclaim Finance and yourself, Louise, has done a lot of work that you use, Chiara, in the article. Can you talk us through the research that Reclaim Finance has done in this area?
So for this article in particular, but also in general, when we analyze banks' policies and financing activities, we use publicly available sources. So Chiara already mentioned it, ESG documentations, sector policies, annual reports of banks that are, like Chiara mentioned, very difficult to get through. We then look at policies in the fossil fuel sector, for instance, because also it's the most carbon intense, most carbon intense sector. Reclaim Finance has developed two dedicated trackers, policy tracker, one on oil and gas and one on coal, where we compare banks, we assess their policies, their commitments, and then we compare banks, we rank them according to the quality of the commitments and the policies that they have taken. And there are basically two main, let's say, areas or dimensions that a bank can finance, if I can get it a little bit into just explaining how it works for people who listen in to just get a bit of a sense of how that work looks or what that work looks like. So a bank can either finance projects directly, so a new coal mine or a new oil field, etc., or it can finance the companies that are developing these projects. And we're looking at both, and we're actually expecting them to take steps on both levels, so both on the project finance level and on the corporate finance level, because most importantly, actually on the corporate finance level, because the money that goes into fossil fuel expansion, 94% of it is coming from corporate finance. Only 6% is direct project finance. So we really expect banks to take commitments or to put policies into place where they exclude financing to new oil and gas projects, but also to companies that are still developing new oil and gas projects. And then when we have assessed these policies, we also do look at what banks then actually finance. So we compare the promises that they make, basically, or the commitments that they make to their real world financing. And then we compare those. And this is what we have done for the Which article as well, to compare, to assess what do they promise, what do they claim to do, and then what do they actually finance.
And we've also looked at palm oil, soy, timber. Any other examples that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so that was with another not-for-profit called Global Canopy. They have a very similar approach, actually, but this time they focus on the agricultural commodities that are associated with deforestation. So the burning and clearing of forests, which obviously has not just, human cost to like indigenous communities, but also wipes out, I think it's a third of the global forests have been destroyed. Pretty mad figures. And that's things that you probably know about, like palm oil and soy, beef, maybe less obviously rubber, cocoa, coffee they looked at. And these were some of the lowest scoring elements of our investigation. So I don't think any of the banks scored more than about 50% on this measure. So it's a pretty low scoring element. For understandable reasons, perhaps it's just not as progressed as fossil fuel policies and sector exclusion. So I think there's a really long way to go on that front. And Global Canopy have quite strict criteria, but for good reason. They basically want banks to kind of future-proof themselves against this kind of harmful financing. Some of them make quite vague commitments, and we want and they want quite strict and quite clear, transparent exclusions, which is hard to find, I'm afraid.
Well, that leads me on to my next question. I wanted to ask you, how easy or how difficult was it to carry out this research? How transparent are banks about this?
So I'm going to be frank. I hate doing this project because it's so hard. It's really fascinating and it's really interesting, but it's complex on a level that I don't often experience at Which. It's maybe deliberately so, I would say, in some cases. I would say that we had decent engagement from many banks, but there were a few that didn't engage with us at all, really. And I think even those that did, you do get a sense that they they don't like these kinds of questions, right? It's not a comfortable topic for them. And that's because loads of them are still financing fossil fuel expansion, and some of them increased their financing last year. So the figures speak for themselves, and they have confusing exclusion statements. You know, we won't do this, we won't do that. And then when you unpick the detail, they're often meaningless, or far less impressive, at least, than they sound. And that was true time and time again. It is, however, worth saying that there's variation within that. So even among the really big financiers, we called them the red banks in the article. These are the ones that do most of the financing, the harmful financing. Even within that group, there is a big difference, not just in terms of figures, but in terms of transparency and the clarity of their exclusions. But I'd say broadly, there's a huge problem with consistency, and you can't compare one to another. Some of them were using really old data still. I think a handful were using data from 2-3 years ago in their latest reports. It's all just a bit of a mess, if I'm honest.
And it doesn't really surprise me, sadly, that some banks didn't want to speak about it, because it just doesn't look good, does it? The facts just don't look good. And Louise, I mean, how does your experience compare to the one that Chiara just painted?
Very similar. I think obviously transparency and accessibility are two different things, right? So we also have to keep in mind banks are businesses. So it's not necessarily in their interest to disclose a lot of information, because they have rivals and they don't necessarily want the information about their business details to be out there. And if they do disclose this information, it's not because they're nice, and it's not because they are doing this out of goodwill. It's because there are laws that regulate and force them to disclose a certain amount of and a certain kind of information. So the ones that they do have to disclose, it is also in their interest to formulate it in a way that is it's more of a language that is designed to hide information rather than to disclose them. And especially banks' policies, like Chiara described it already, you know, like they sound very bold sometimes. It's very long. It's a very specific language that you have to understand. You have to unpack the meaning of each word and know what goes into each word. And so much is hidden within one word that makes it sound very bold, very great, and gives this impression of, wow, we are so on track on everything that we set ourselves up to. And when you then start to analyze, well, what does this word actually mean? You see that they are, mostly making up an entire language that, as I said, is hiding more than it's disclosing. I don't know if maybe you want to have just one example to showcase this kind of language. One, I think, at least a great example that I think even professionals have difficulties wrapping their heads around, because it's so abstract and it's so far off the real world in a sense, is facilitated emissions. I think is a very, very good example of that, because facilitated emissions basically measure the greenhouse gas emissions of a bank, of the money that they are not directly lending, but that they are facilitating, so that they are helping companies to receive on the bond market. So it's basically the emissions that come from a bond that banks are underwriting or structuring, for instance. And then a lot of banks, when you look at their reports and their sustainability reports, they say and they show we are, 45% above our facilitated emission target already. So we're doing great. And everybody gets this impression of this bank is doing amazing. They are completely on track for 1.5, etc. But then when you look at how facilitated emissions are actually calculated, and you have to dig a lot to find this information and then to unpack that language, you will see that actually in the calculation of facilitated emissions, there are just financial metrics going into it, such as corporate value. The corporate value goes into calculating a bank's facilitated emission. So when for instance, it's just an example, the corporate value. When a corporate value goes up or down, the bank's facilitated emission goes up or down. So it's kind of arbitrary and doesn't have any, or doesn't need to have any real world emission reduction impact if a facilitated emission goes up or down. So this is just one example of how this sustainability finance language is really designed to make you think that what they're disclosing is good and they are on track for what they're doing, because otherwise it makes it more it would make it easier to monitor them, but also to sanction them and to hold them accountable, which is obviously not something that they want to do.
Well, I feel like I want to talk about it, and I'm sure our listeners want to hear, how did the banks do? I mean, you've mentioned already, Chiara, the red banks, as you call them in the article.
So in an attempt to simplify an extremely complicated topic, in the magazine, we used a sort of an amber system. So the red banks are the financiers. So these are the big banks. These are the big global banks that do the lion's share of financing of fossil fuels. And then we rated the rest of the banks in a slightly more nuanced way. So with the amber banks, these are banks that either, due to the nature of the way that they're set up, either don't do that kind of banking at all. So your Monzos spring to mind. But then there are also some other banks that do have some financing deals to energy companies, but at a really small scale. So a much smaller percentage of their business. And we actually only had two eco providers. So 2 of 16 were deemed transparent enough and robust enough to be named eco providers. That was Triodos and the Cooperative Bank, just those two.
Chiara, I want to hear what sets those apart from the worst offenders, but I also do want to hear you name some names. Who were the worst offenders? Because I know there were some big household brands in there.
So when we did our eco assessment, Chase, run by JP Morgan, was the worst across every measure we tested, and by some distance. It came out with a total policy score of 10%. And even within the sort of big red banks, the big fossil fuel financiers, the highest scoring bank, Danske Bank, was 47%. So a really big difference. Some of the other banks that performed poorly were Santander, HSBC, and Barclays.
I mean, it's quite shocking, isn't it, that we literally are talking about some of our high street banks here. Louise, what makes these worst offenders, so bad in this area?
Yeah, I think Barclays is really one that is standing out because it is Europe's worst fossil fuel financier, according to the Banking on Climate Chaos report. So they are really, in terms of the real world financing that they are doing, they are absolutely the worst in Europe. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they are the only European bank that ranked in the dirty dozen globally of the worst fossil fuel financiers, also according to the Banking on Climate Chaos. And they are, HSBC and Barclays are more or less sharing the top 2 positions when it comes to fossil fuel expansion. I think Barclays is slightly worse than HSBC, but they are relatively similar. So they are really leading, from the UK banks at least, they are really leading the fossil fuel expansion with their financing. And they are also both banks. Both banks are the first European banks that, as Chiara mentioned, quit the NZBA. While, for instance, HSBC has been really on a track of backtracking massively, with their head of sustainability, if I'm not mistaken, saying that he wants to lift the bias of the fossil fuel economy and lift the sanctions against and the biases against fossil fuel companies. So this is really massive and cannot and really shows on which track these banks are, which is really not any kind of alignment with 1.5 on net zero.
And what are the regulators saying about all of this? Is there pressure on them to make some changes and come down a bit harder, perhaps?
There is a bit of a difference between the EU at the moment and the UK. So I think in the EU, we are really witnessing a moment of deregulation, actually, rather than a ramping up of regulation. I think in the UK, it's a bit different. I think it's not as bad as in the EU at the moment, because if I'm not mistaken, you currently have the discussion of making transition plans for banks mandatory by the government, even though the transition plans that are being proposed are relatively mellow. What a credible transition plan would need to include or better exclude is any financing for fossil fuel expansion. And this at the moment is also not happening in the UK proposition of mandatory transition plans. But what regulators could and should do is develop a common understanding of what is expected from banks, because at the moment everybody just does a little bit what they want. Banks can define sustainability and can define transition plans a bit by themselves. So what regulators should do is offer a common understanding of what a good transition plan away from fossil fuels look like. And one red line that needs to be included is the red line for financing fossil fuel expansion, which is just not something that, according to science, no banks should be doing anymore. And actually, we also see, and this is maybe to also have one positive note in it, the Science-Based Targets Initiative recently updated their standard in July, actually, that if a bank wants to be verified by them or have their decarbonization targets verified by them, they have to exclude financing for companies that are still expanding their fossil fuel business. So this is actually quite a positive note, and one that that might spark a bit of a trend into the right direction.
I'm so pleased that you ended on a positive note there, because we do need to have a little bit of that. And I will ask you about, what we might be able to expect in the future. But first, I do just want to touch on, as consumers, what does this mean for us? What can we do? Would you recommend switching your bank?
I would. I think actually a lot of people assume that there isn't any point, but it's our money that they're using to do this. I mean, on a scale that feels kind of impossible to get your head around sometimes, but it's the only power move we have. The only power move we have is to switch to a bank that does have a credible transition plan, or to switch to a bank that doesn't do this kind of financing. And so I think you can learn more. I would say maybe your bank's reports are the worst place to look, because as we've covered, they're confusing, complex, and sometimes misleading. But there are other ways to find out. So as we've said, Reclaim Finance have these tools, these tracker tools for coal and oil, and gas. There's also a website called banktrack.org, I believe, and they list the actual deals themselves. So the projects being funded, makes for pretty grim reading, I won't lie to you, but it's so fascinating. You'll see what's being funded and who by, and the scale of it is horrendous. So if you know that your bank's funding these kinds of harmful projects and you don't want to be associated with that, then you can leave, and you can tell them that that's why you've left, and eventually they'll have to listen.
Very important advice to end on there. But just to leave our listeners then with hopefully something a little positive, if we can, on what we maybe can expect in the future. Louise, do you want to start us off?
It is obviously difficult to make any predictions in a moment where we're witnessing this massive tectonic shift of power dynamics globally. But I do want to emphasize what Chiara said. I think a lot of people have this notion of money being in their bank sleeping, but that's not the case. When you have your money in a bank, this money is used to finance those companies that are actually driving humanity and the planet into collapse. So it is difficult in these times where people are struggling to make ends meet and struggling with a lot of things, where we have crises and wars and genocides going on, to also ask them to do something on climate change. But there is something that they can actually do, and it's simple, and it doesn't cost money, and it doesn't take a lot of time, which is what Chiara said. Take your money out of these banks and put them into a bank where you know that they are not financing fossil fuel expansion. And this is something, we are an ecosystem of power. We are a collective power. And the more established powers are shaking, the more important it becomes to organize bottom-up power. And it is your money. It is your power, so you can make it count. And together with NGOs and grassroots movement and civil society organizations like ours, we can make this power count. And if you actually do change your bank because you just listened to this podcast, I would be so happy if you wrote me a message, and we will make our best from our side to integrate this into our campaigning, to do our share in our engagement and in our campaigning towards the banks to get them out of fossil fuel expansion. And I think this is our collective power. Everyone can play their part and organize into a collective act of resistance. I think it's up to us to define our expectations of what needs to change and then make it happen together as a collective power.
And where can our listeners find you?
They can find us on LinkedIn, or they can just write me an email at louise@reclaimfinance.org. They can also look into our oil and gas policy trackers, which they can find by researching for oil and gas policy trackers if you want to dig a bit more into comparing the banks. If you're more looking into coal, you can just research the coal policy tracker and you will find everything that you need to know, hopefully. And if you don't, also pop us a message for everything that you need more.
Thank you, Louise. Very inspiring end note there. And Chiara, where can our listeners find out more about everything we've talked about today?
So, as I said, I do think people that are interested in this can do a lot of their own research, but we've also collated all of our research into this on the Which website. And we give you details not only about our eco providers, but about the rest as well. So you can check for your specific bank.
And we can pop a link to that as well as any other useful resources into the description of today's show. Well, just want to end and say a very big thank you to you both. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Which, the UK's consumer champion. You can find plenty more advice about what we discussed today in the show notes. There you'll also find a link to become a Which member for 50% off the usual price, an offer exclusively available to you, our podcast listeners. Joining Which will not only give you access to our product reviews, our app, one-to-one personalised buying advice, and every issue of Which magazine across the year, but you'll also be helping us to make life simpler, fairer and safer for everyone. Don't forget to hit subscribe wherever you're listening. That way you'll be notified whenever we release a new episode of Which Money, Which Shorts, or any other podcast that we make for you. And if you want to get in touch with us, then follow us on social media at Which UK or drop us an email to podcast@which.co.uk. See you next time.
If you're enjoying this podcast from us here at Which, then why not become a Which member? Right now, we've got a special offer, especially for podcast listeners, meaning you can choose any of our 3 membership tiers for 50% off the usual price. Starting at just £39.50 for a full year, you can get Which magazine delivered direct to your door. For the same price, you could also choose a digital Which subscription, giving you access to all of our product reviews, the Which app, and the digital edition of Which magazine. What's more, you'll also be able to use the Ask Which service for personalised one-to-one buying advice. Or why not get a full access Which subscription for just £49.50 for a full year? Don't forget, that's 50% off the usual price. To join Which or to find out more, just head to which.co.uk/podcast offer. That's which.co.uk/podcast offer, or click the link in the description for today's podcast for 50% off a Which annual subscription.